On today's show, the Capitals' plans at the draft according to GM Ross Mahoney. Next on this edition of Locked On Capitals.
Your Locked On Capitals, your daily podcast on the Washington Capitals. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Well, hello and welcome into this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Dan Holme. I've covered the Capitals for the past 3 seasons for Locked On and various other outlets before that. I'm also the host of the weekly show called The Capitals Minutecast, available wherever you find your podcasts. And as always, I want to thank you for making this your first listen of the day. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. So in this edition of Locked On Capitals, it is going to be a busy week or so for the Capitals as we have free agency on July 1st. And before that, we have the draft and some big decisions that could ultimately change the outcome of this team. We'll talk about that a bit later. We'll talk about unrestricted free agents, who stays and who walks. I think it is a known thing, of course, that not all the players that we saw from the 24-25 season will be returning back in the 25-26 season. Which of the UFAs will be here and which will be gone? I'll talk about that a bit later. We'll talk about restricted free agents. I'm talking Hendrix Lapierre and Alex Alexiev. But just to get it going here, we're talking about draft day decisions, best player available or trade, RFAs, UFAs, and Ross Mahoney's press conference today. About 17 minutes or so, he spoke to the media and entering into his 28th draft. This is a guy that has been there and done that, and just listening to him year after year, his philosophies are pretty much the same. And I like that because to listen to the guy, you can just really understand what kind of mastermind he is as far as being one of the big shots for the Capitals' developmental side of things. So you take a look at, the Capitals and who they've drafted here recently, talking Crystal, Leonard, Tarek Parasek, all these big name players, that he is the mastermind in large part, not exclusively, but he is one of the big masterminds behind that and has been for years. And he spoke that this is the first year that they're going to have a decentralized draft. They had the COVID one that was similar to that about 5 years ago, but this is going to be a little bit different. And ultimately, I like the way this is trending. But just to get it going here, talking about the press conference and what he had to say, talking about this. And, when you watch the draft, it appears that it's kind of random. The Capitals, you're on the clock. Who are you going to pick? And, they just fill in the blank name. Yeah, sure. That's right. That there is a tremendous amount of scouting preparation that goes into this, that it is hardly anything but random. I think that to be good at this, that you have to be able to adjust on the fly, as you've seen Miro, for example. Ivan Miroshnichenko went a little bit different in the draft than I think a lot of people thought. And also Andrew Crystal, I remember Mahoney talking about that they kind of felt like they couldn't believe that he was still available, and that changed everything. So I think that you go into the draft with kind of a rough sketch in your mind, but you don't know exactly what you're going to do until the moment calls for it. And, one of the things that we know is that the Capitals are going to be picking a little bit later, 27th overall. So a little bit different. You think back a couple seasons when they selected Ryan Leonard and how exciting that was. And, all the buzz out there if it was going to be Matvei Mishka for Benson and all these other guys. But a little bit different this year, a little bit later. And ultimately, what are they going to be able to do? But the philosophy around the Capitals has not changed. And it's the right philosophy. You don't want to draft for position. If you ask me, what is the positions of need for the Capitals? Of course, I'm going to say a defender. We know that, John Carlson is going to be retiring somewhat here soon, but we could also use some depth on the left side. But I think what's important to remember is that these players that are drafted more than likely are not going to be good to go for years to come. So you can't really draft for a John Carlson replacement. I guess you can, but just with the understanding that there's, a 99%, maybe not 99, but there is a majority chance that he is not going to be ready to go after John Carlson hangs it up. He might be the answer in the long term, but the thing that he said is you draft for the best player available. And he recited an example when George McPhee was still the GM. And one particular year, they had drafted Varlamov in the first round and Michael Neuwirth in the second round. And one of the things he talked about is that they were thinking about going with a netminder for their third pick as well. And he talked about, I believe the netminder was Steve Mason, and George McPhee's like, I think we're pretty good on netminding. I don't think we need to do that. And they ended up kicking themselves because how you have to look at it and why you want to pick the best player available is what is one of the things that I talked about through the first 40 picks or so. It's primarily centers, and it is forwards more specifically. There's not some real grade A talent in his perception in the first 1 through 40 pick. That primarily the picks 1 through 40 are going to be forwards, and more specifically centers. That when the time is right and the Capitals make a selection, they don't want to pass up on a forward, a center, for example, that is a better player in favor of a player that might not be as good just because they're trying to, draft a defender or a goalie, something like that. And that is sound logic. And it's not too novel. It's not just the Capitals or Ross Mahoney that does that. That just makes sense. You don't go into this draft going, there is a replacement for John Carlson. That might be the case, but if there is a better forward available, a center, then that is what you do. And even if you have a glut of talent at that position, if you don't have options for them within the organization, you can view them as pieces that you can trade to maybe get the player that you want. So that's what I think is important. So who the Capitals pick at 27th overall very well might be a forward, a center, a wing, something of that nature. So don't be too up in arms if it's not a defender or maybe a player that you had circled. So sound logic, best player available. Underline that, bookmark that in your brain going into the draft, because if you go into the draft thinking that we need a defenseman and they pass on a better forward, you're just asking to regret it 3 years down the line. And Mahoney even said it here. He said, quote, "We always tried to stick with taking the best players available unless you're splitting hairs," unquote. So say you're looking at two players that are comparable. Say there's a defender, say there's a forward, and there's not a big difference between the two of them, a big disparity, then it's more of a judgment call. But if there is a forward, a center more specifically, that is available for the Capitals, then that's who they should draft. So you got to remember that when we watch this. And that's how we ended up getting guys like Andrew Crystal, who I spoke about, Ilya Protas, Cole Hudson, right? The front office has earned a little trust on draft day. And I have the utmost confidence in Ross Mahoney and his crew. Make no mistake about it. There's not even a little bit of me that's like, I don't trust this guy. When you listen to him talk, he is very smart, and you can tell that he's done this a long time, suffices to say. But he also said this, and I want you to hear it. He said, quote, "There's always a chance that a pick could get moved." The 27th overall pick, it's on the table. And it's not too surprising. They might end up, moving that to get more NHL ready talent, because, when you get down to number 27, like I say, you're getting a little bit lower down in the draft. A player that's not going to be able to be, let's say NHL ready, most likely for years to come. Now, Mahoney made it clear he'd prefer to keep it, but if the right deal is there, if it brings a guy who pushes the team closer to a Stanley Cup, he's not blinking. And I think it was Stephen Wino that was talking. You listen to these guys talk so much, you can kind of identify their voices. I'm pretty sure it was Steve Wino that was talking about it there, that the possibility of moving on from or moving the pick, not using it in the draft, but trying to get some NHL ready talent. And he said, just from my perspective, I kind of hope we draft a player, because that's what our crew does, is we put a lot of homework in. There's a lot of games watched. There's a lot of evaluation, that if it's up to him, and it's not exclusively, but if it was exclusively up to him, it would be a draft pick for sure. But he said, quote, if you're making a trade to acquire an asset that puts you over the hump, then by all means, you go with that, unquote. So that is something to consider as well, is that if you take a look at it and say, the Capitals can move that pick in favor of some more NHL ready talent, that's a good thing. Or there's the possibility of moving up or down, or whatever the case is in the draft. There is a lot of different scenarios in there. But the one thing I know for sure is this is going to be an exciting time for the Capitals. Young talent. And like I say, Ross Mahoney and his crew have knocked it out of the park for years here. That it'll be interesting to see who ultimately the Capitals end up picking in the draft. I know I've spoke about this in yesterday's show, but the presser was today. So I thought I'd go over that roughly 17-minute press conference that he had with the Capitals press corps. All right, so coming up here after the break, we'll talk about restricted free agents. Hendrik Lapierre, Alex Alexiev. What's the master plan with those two? I'll discuss straight ahead. Guys, you've probably heard of Viagra or Cialis. Maybe you've heard or tried them, but if you're looking for something beyond the usual pill, then it's time to meet Rougiette Ready. Rougiette Ready is next-gen prescription treatment designed to amplify arousal in the brain and boost blood flow. Unlike the usual pills that can take hours, Rougiette's 3-in-1 formula dissolves under your tongue and kicks in fast. An average in 15 minutes. Effects can last up to 36 hours, so you can stay confident and control when the moment is right. And if you take a look at it, you may have tried some other options before. I think that it is worth giving Rougiette an opportunity. And the good thing here is Rougiette connects you with board-certified doctors and ships your treatment discreetly to your door. You can even have real customer reviews on their site. It's helping a lot of people feel more confident and present in the moment. So head to rougiette.com/LockedOnNHL and use code LockedOnNHL to get 15% off. That's RUGIET.com/LockedOnNHL and use promo code LockedOnNHL for 15% off. Individual results may vary with prescription treatments, compounded drugs, and permitted to be prescribed under federal law, but are not FDA approved and do not undergo FDA safety, effectiveness, or manufacturing review. Please visit Rougiette website for all safety information. All right, welcome back into this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. You can find me over on Twitter. It's at DanCaps218. You can find the show on Twitter. It's at Locked On Caps. So this is a big week or so coming up for the Capitals. In segment number 1 there, I was talking about Ross Mahoney, the mastermind of the draft, has been for years. And in segment 2 here, we're going to talk about restricted free agents, because it's not just the draft that could change the outcome of this organization. There are players that could be on the move, players that the Capitals organization had high hopes on for years. Maybe the Capitals will decide this year that they don't want to try retread those tires anymore. So let's talk about that in segment number 2 here. We're talking restricted free agents. And let's start talking with a big name, Hendrik Lapierre. There has been a lot of hope surrounding Hendricks for years that he is going to be the answer center. And I think that he very well might be in the mix for that third line center position. Early take, I think it goes to Connor McMichael, unless Chris Patrick goes outside of the organization to address that situation. But, all things considered, tough season. LaPierre started with a big team, was up for the first 3 months, played 27 games. But the hopes that we had hoped for him didn't come true. Just 8 assists, not what you want to see. And the question mark on the third line that what was there all season, more specifically the third line center position. And we saw a few different players cycle through LaPierre, Scarbosa, until the Capitals finally traded for and acquired a familiar name in Lars Eller. But the thing I like about Hendrix Lapierre, and oftentimes I'm hard on him, and the thing I always say, that if I'm shooting the arrows, I'm handing out the applause as well, is of a very mature Hendrix Lapierre. I think going into last season, he felt like, this is it. I finally made it. I broke camp with the team. This is going to be my year. Wasn't the case. Was sent down to Hershey, and guess what? Didn't sulk, didn't moan, didn't think to himself, I'm too good to be playing in the American Hockey League, and really started to take off. Like I said, got sent down to Hershey, and the kid averages a point per game in 32 outings. So the skill is there, right? And, I don't think that was ever up for debate. It was all about sustainability, and the different opportunities that we saw from Hendrix Lapierre was never sustainable. And kind of gets oftentimes lumped into the same name and category as Connor McMichael, because they came up around the same time. And Connor McMichael, if we remember, didn't stick right away. So could the 25-26 season be the season for Mr. Hendrix Lapierre? You take a look at it. He's not a rookie anymore, so we can kind of take the training wheels off of him and say, well, he's still just a young guy in the league. He's got 51 NHL games under his belt. This isn't his first rodeo, so that 874,000 qualifying offer, he's probably not signing for that. And what I'm hearing, and this makes sense, is a 1-year, $1 million bridge deal, giving him another shot to stick full-time, low risk, low commitment. And honestly, that is all I would agree to. I would agree to a small deal to see if he's worth it, because, and to be clear here, I would not be surprised one bit if I found out that the Capitals traded Hendrix Lapierre in favor of maybe an NHL-ready player, like a bundle deal, or if they did it for a prospect, a draft pick, that kind of thing, because at a certain point, and I know that as Capitals fans, we like Hendrix Lapierre. The talk out there has been for years that he's going to be one of those young, big names on the team, has not made it. How many seasons, how many years do the Capitals want to keep trying to retread the Hendrix Lapierre tire? So a 1 year, like I said, a $1 million bridge deal, that I would sign off for, to kind of prove it, to say, this is your time to shine, that this season you better kill it or we're on to the next one. So very, very interesting. Now, another player is Alex Alexiev, and he's an interesting one as well. Kind of tough to read, technically on the NHL roster all year, but the guy only played 8 games. That's it, plus 3 on a conditioning stint in Hershey. So you take a look at it, not totally fair for him, as he spent a lion's share of the season in the cryogenic deep freeze, but, he left a bit to be desired. And, listening to his fellow teammates, they said that, put in an honest work effort at practice, even though there were good chunks of the entire season, pretty much up until the playoffs, that he didn't play. He kept a good attitude. But when, Marty Faravari got injured and they had an emergency and they opened up the cupboard, that was the player that they reached for, and didn't kind of live up to what I had hoped. So, it's going to be an interesting thing as well if they decide to move on from him. You're also talking about the extracurricular activities that we witnessed after the conclusion of the season, that I would not be surprised at all if the Capitals decide to move on from him. And if I'm the GM right now, I would do that. I've been high on Alex Alexiev at different points in his career, and it just has not been the case. You take a look couple summers ago it was going to be his year, and all of a sudden the Capitals decided to bring in Joel Edmondson, right? And so he was blocked there, and then he's dealt with injuries from here and there. It just has never been his time. So his qualifying offer is just under $919,000. Maybe they run it back with a 1-year deal. Maybe. Or maybe they cut bait. Again, I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, he's a 25-year-old bubble guy. Maybe he needs a fresh start somewhere else. And we've witnessed that. Sometimes a change of zip code, a change of jersey, and sometimes they take off. You know, if you want another example, Darcy Kemper didn't fit in with the Capitals, played very well with the Kings. So, you know, kind of in a similar regard that, you know, sometimes it's not that they're bad players. It's just that they're looking for a fresh start. Maybe that is the case. But again, if you're asking me, I would be fine if the Capitals decided to move on from Alex Alexiev. You know, they have younger prospects in the pipeline. You know, I'm thinking Vinny Iorio, Chase Prisky, you know, these different players like this that are going to be the next wave on the Capitals blue line. So some intriguing questions for the Capitals to answer. Again, it is going to be a very busy week or so for the Capitals. Big changes could be in store. I guess we just have to wait. All right, so coming up here after the break, we'll talk about unrestricted free agents. Who stays? Who walks? Straight ahead. All right, welcome back into this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. The best way that you can help grow the show is to subscribe to Locked On Capitals on YouTube and comment anything down below. So in the final segment 3 here, we're talking about unrestricted free agents. And I know I've touched on this, but we're getting closer here. And I'm going to kind of go over the lay of the land when it comes to unrestricted free agents and make a statement for, you know, should they stay? Should they go? It's going to be interesting what players, jump off the page. And I'll dive into that. We're talking Mangiapane, Taylor Radish, Anthony Beauvillier. I think some of those players are more destined to be on this team than others. So let's dive into that in segment number 3, and we're going to talk about Anthony Beauvillier, the only player the Capitals traded for and acquired on the trade deadline. And all things considered, I thought it was going to be a depth piece. You know, I had some experience playing on the wing, some at center. I thought maybe the third line center. And guess what happened? In the playoffs, we even saw him play on the first line with Strome and Ovechkin. And guess what? For this quote-unquote for Dan depth move, he didn't really look out of place. And it shouldn't have really been as any surprise as that guy also played big minutes with Sidney Crosby with the Penguins. So he has it there. But Anthony Beauvillier started slow after the trade, but 6 points in 10 playoff games, that helps. He's not getting back to that $4.15 million range he had before, but doubling his $1.25 million from this past year, I think totally possible. I'm thinking maybe 2 years at, let's say, $2.5 million, something like that. And that's what I spoke about on this show before. I'm going to say like a 2-year deal. I'm not, I don't see a scenario where Anthony Beauvillier gets like a 4, 5, 6-year deal. I think that the Capitals, I think they want to see what's out there. And I think that Anthony Beauvillier, amongst the players I'm going to talk about in this segment, is the guy that I would bring back. As, like I said, did not look out of place with a lot of responsibility. Spencer Carberry said he was a bit like a Swiss Army knife, played seamlessly, whether it was on the first line, the third line, wherever, and he played very well. The other guy that I'm going to talk about here next is Andrew Mangiapane. Talk about a swing and miss. Not totally. There were glimpses of things I liked about Andrew Mangiapane. But, I think in his mind, he still thinks that he's Andrew Mangiapane from a few years ago when he put up big points with Calgary. Not the case. And not a total bust, I'm going to say, for the Capitals. But let's talk about him. The Caps brought him in hoping for a rebound, and it was a good idea. Sometimes with these guys, you don't know, but didn't get it. Just 28 points, the lowest total in years. And the thing of it is, he made $5.8 million on his last deal. And if you're asking me, I don't think that's happening again. I'd say if I had to kind of throw a dart at the wall, I'd say 3 million tops on a short-term flyer. Honestly, I wouldn't be shocked if the Caps passed on him. And that's kind of the belief out there, that he is going to be on to the next one, that Andrew Mangiapane will not be coming back to the Capitals. Again, things I liked about him, we saw him play okay at times on that third line. But all things considered, I see a kind of a major restructuring on that third line, just based on Chris Patrick. The Capitals, if you're a fan, you knew that was kind of a sore spot. But taking a look at Taylor Radish, I think the expectation on Taylor Radish was a bit lower. But, taking a look at him, I think a solid value, 27 points, low average time on ice, signed for just $1 million. And he probably earned himself a slight raise, whether it's with the Caps, whether it's somewhere else, could be back for around 1.75 to 2 mil on, I'm going to say like a 1 to 2 year deal. Not flashy, but reliable. If I found out the Capitals brought back Taylor Radish to play, on the fourth line, maybe the third line, something like that, I wouldn't be surprised. But I, in that situation, am kind of also leaning towards moving on to the next one as well. Again, in this segment, I think that Anthony Beauvillier is the most likely to return. I've talked about Mangiapane, Taylor Radish, next Ethan Bear, and I spoke about him, a few episodes ago as well, but I'm trying to put them all together in a group here for you. And this one didn't work out, and he was given permission to speak to other teams, and he got paid, but he played just 24 NHL games with the Capitals, spent all year this past year in Hershey. We know that he was one of the guys that could have gone in the playoffs. They went with Alex Alexiev. It could have gone with Ethan Bear. And all things considered, there was a lot of hope around Ethan Bear before the Capitals brought him here. There was, buzz. Is he going to this team? Is he going to that team? And it seemed like a real coup for the Capitals to get Ethan Bear, as the buzz around the Capitals organization was he was going to be one of the future faces with Rasmus Sandin on the blue line. Not the case, but all things considered, when the players' assistance program came back, played with Hershey this past season, and played very, very well. Again, I like to give credit where credit is due, but at the end of the day, I think that Ethan Bear is destined for a different team. And again, I wish him nothing but the best, but I think that just was not what I'm going to generalize and say a good fit with the Capitals. And to close it out here, again, I'm going to talk about Lars Eller. I don't think you really need to talk about it more, but I am going to go over the restricted and unrestricted free agents. And Lars Eller, 36 years old, again, we'll never forget his contributions, the 2018 Stanley Cup win, and still putting up double-digit goals this past season between Pittsburgh and the Capitals. Again, I'm just trying to be an accurate assessor of the situation. He's slowing down, but he can still win draws. And one of the things he talked about is that he had, I want to say it was his lowest minute ice time this past season than he had since he was a rookie. But a lot of that is due in large part that third line was a liability. And I don't think that they just like the third line that much because, well, it wasn't very productive. But, he can still win draws, kill penalties, and jump into your third line in a pinch. If he comes back, and I don't think he's coming back to the Capitals, he is going to sign like a veteran minimum type deal. And that's about it. But, I've been wrong on these before. When I take a look at, Max Pacioretty, for example, I thought that when he was done with the Capitals, his best days were behind him, and was a contributor for the Maple Leafs, glimpses of greatness there. So sometimes, like I said, if you can kind of just generalize some of these players, sometimes a change of scenery, a change of zip code can be what the doctor ordered. But of those unrestricted free agents, I'm going to go ahead and say circle Anthony Beauvillier is coming back. The rest of them, I think they are on to the next one. All right. Once again, I want to thank you for joining me on this edition of Locked On Capitals, your only daily year-round podcast covering the Capitals. And I want to thank all of you that listen on the audio side and watch this on YouTube. You are what makes this show successful. When you're done here, head on over to Locked On NHL, as they have you covered 5 days a week, available wherever you find your podcasts and on YouTube. All right, once again, I want to thank you for joining me on this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. It is your team every day. My name is Dan Holme, and I'll talk to you again next time.